In the quiet woods of northern Vermont, a family vanished without a trace. For years, there were no answers. Only fear, silence, and a mystery that haunted the town of Maple Hollow. The Wright family, a father, mother, and their young daughter, set out on what was supposed to be a simple camping trip in 2016. They were never seen alive again. For 6 years, the town searched, speculated, and prayed. No leads, no closure, just the gnawing question, what happened to the Wrights? Then, one ordinary autumn morning, a hunter's dog unearthed the secret the forest had been keeping, and Maple Hollow was forced to confront a truth darker than anyone had imagined. The forest of northern Vermont is a place of beauty and silence, where the canopy of ancient pines swallows sound, and the trails vanish into mist. On a cool autumn morning, a hunter named Daniel Myers ventured into these woods, accompanied only by his loyal retriever, Scout. The forest was familiar to Daniel, a second home where he'd hunted for decades. But on this morning, something was different. The air was unnervingly still. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of his boots on damp earth and the panting of his dog. Scout trotted ahead, nose pressed to the ground. First, Daniel thought nothing of it. Dogs often chase scents, deer, rabbit, fox. But then Scout froze. His tail stiffened, hackles raised. Slowly, he began pawing at the soil near a cluster of moss-covered stones. Daniel called out, but Scout ignored him, digging harder, whining as if urging his master closer. With each scrape of the dog's paws, the earth gave way to something pale beneath the dirt. Daniel stepped forward, frowning. He knelt, brushed aside loose soil, and froze. A fragment of fabric emerged first, tattered, weather-worn. Then came something far more chilling, the unmistakable curve of a human bone. Daniel staggered back, his breath caught in his throat. He knew these woods were vast, unforgiving. People got lost, sometimes never returned. But what Scout had uncovered was not the fresh tragedy of a lost hiker. This was something else, something hidden, something meant never to be found. As Daniel pulled out his phone with trembling hands to dial 911, his mind raced. What had been buried here in the heart of the Vermont wilderness? And why, after years of silence, had it finally come to light? The discovery that morning would shatter the calm of a quiet town, dredge up a mystery long thought unsolvable, and reveal a story darker than anyone could have imagined. The Wright family was not extraordinary in the eyes of the world, but in the small town of Maple Hollow, Vermont, they were deeply woven into the fabric of daily life. Mark Wright, the father, was 42 years old, a tall man with broad shoulders and a quiet presence. He worked as a regional manager for a hardware supply company. His colleagues described him as dependable, a man who could diffuse tension with a single calm word. Though his job often required travel, Mark always made sure he was home for the important things: Emily's school recitals, Sarah's community events, Sunday dinners. Sarah Wright, 39, was the kind of woman people noticed even in silence. With soft brown hair often pulled back in a loose braid, she carried herself with a warmth that drew people in. Sarah worked part-time at the local library, where children flocked to her story hours. She also organized Maple Hollow's seasonal events, the Fall Harvest Festival, the winter food drives. Neighbors often joked that Sarah was the unofficial mayor of their side of town. Their daughter, Emily, had just turned 12. At school, she was known for her curiosity and her laughter that carried down the hallways. She loved drawing, kept a notebook full of sketches of animals, and had recently joined the school's soccer team. To her parents, Emily was the bright flame at the center of their lives. The Wrights lived in a modest colonial-style house on the edge of Maple Hollow, the kind of home where the porch light was always on and where the smell of Sarah's cooking often drifted across the street. They weren't wealthy, but they were stable. They weren't flashy, but they were respected. And in Maple Hollow, respect meant everything. Maple Hollow was one of those places that seemed frozen in time. Nestled against the backdrop of rolling hills and dense forests, its population barely scratched 5,000. It had one high school, one diner, a post office, and a gas station that doubled as the town's social hub. For generations, families had lived and died here, their names etched into headstones in the old churchyard. Outsiders passed through but rarely stayed. Life moved at a slower pace, and for many, that was its charm. But for all its postcard beauty, Maple Hollow had an unspoken rule. The woods were to be respected. The forest loomed like a wall of shadow around the town, ancient and untamed. Children were warned not to wander too deep. Hunters spoke of strange echoes, of tracks that appeared and vanished without reason. Over the years, a handful of hikers had gone missing, their names eventually reduced to whispers. Locals called it the silence of the woods. Still, for families like the Wrights, the forest was less a threat and more a tradition. Every autumn, when the leaves turned gold and crimson, Mark and Sarah would take Emily on a camping trip. It was their ritual, no phones, no distractions, just the three of them beneath the stars. They built fires, roasted marshmallows, and told stories passed down through generations. To the Wrights, the forest wasn't just wilderness. It was memory, history, belonging. In October of 2016, the Wrights prepared for what would become their final trip. Friends remembered Sarah posting on social media the night before, "Excited for our yearly camping tradition, disconnecting for the weekend with my favorite people." Mark told his coworkers he'd be offline, but joked he might check emails if cell service held. Emily had just gotten a new sketchbook and announced she planned to draw the woods while they camped. They packed their old blue SUV with sleeping bags, lanterns, and a cooler filled with Sarah's cooking. To neighbors, it looked like any other year. A happy family heading out to make more memories. But none of them could have imagined that within hours of driving into the wilderness, the Wrights would vanish without a trace. And Maple Hollow, a town where nothing ever seemed to happen, would never be the same. The Wrights left their home on the morning of October 14th, 2016. It was a crisp Friday, the kind where the air bites at your lungs and the first frost clings stubbornly to the grass. Mark loaded the SUV while Sarah double-checked their supplies. Emily bounced around the driveway, sketchbook in hand, impatient to get moving. Neighbors saw them pulling out around 9:30 a.m. Sarah waved, as she always did. Emily pressed her hands against the window, grinning. To anyone watching, it was a perfectly ordinary scene. No one imagined it would be the last time they were seen alive. The family headed north toward Granite Ridge State Park, a sprawling wilderness that stretched for miles. It was a popular camping spot, but vast enough that you could vanish into solitude within minutes of leaving the main trails. At 11:02 a.m., Sarah's phone pinged a text to her sister. "We just passed the ranger station. Should be at the site soon. Talk Sunday." That was the last message ever sent from her phone. At 11:37 a.m., a gas station security camera on Route 9 captured the Wrights' SUV pulling off the highway. Mark was seen at the pump, Emily inside the car, Sarah buying snacks inside. Nothing unusual, no one following them, no signs of tension. By noon, they had driven deeper into the state park. Witnesses later reported seeing a blue SUV on the gravel road leading to the Black Hollow campgrounds. After that, the trail went cold. When Sunday evening came and went without a call from Sarah, her sister grew uneasy. By Monday morning, her worry turned into panic. Sarah was reliable, never one to go silent for long. She phoned the local sheriff's office, explaining that she hadn't heard from her sister since Friday. At first, Deputies assumed it was a case of poor reception in the park. But when Mark failed to show up for work on Monday, and Emily missed school, concern escalated. A welfare check was ordered. The search begins. By Tuesday, October 18th, rangers and deputies began combing Granite Ridge. The Wright's SUV was found abandoned near a trailhead leading into Black Hollow, the same area where witnesses had last spotted them. The vehicle was locked, keys missing. Inside were the family's belongings: Sarah's purse, Emily's sketchbook, and several camping supplies. Oddly, their tent and sleeping bags were gone, as if they had been set up somewhere deeper in the woods. Search dogs were deployed, picking up faint scents leading into the forest, but losing them within half a mile. Helicopters scanned the ridges, and volunteers scoured trails. For days, hundreds of people combed the wilderness, and yet no trace of the Wrights was found. No campsite, no discarded wrappers, not a single footprint. It was as if they had walked into the trees and vanished. With each passing day, tension in Maple Hollow grew. Theories circulated like wildfire. Some believed the family had gotten lost, that an accident had claimed their lives. But seasoned rangers insisted that in such a well-traveled area, signs would have turned up quickly. Others whispered about foul play, an attack, and abduction. Rumors spread of strange sightings near the park. A man in a dark pickup seen loitering at the trailhead. Campers who swore they heard screams echoing in the distance. One hiker reported seeing flashes of light deep in the woods the night the Wrights disappeared, like someone with a lantern moving off trail. But every lead ended in a dead end. Witnesses conflicted, evidence non-existent. The Wrights were simply gone. Weeks dragged into months. Winter set in, burying the forest under snow. The official search was scaled back, though volunteers continued to comb the woods on weekends. Maple Hollow changed. Doors once left unlocked were now bolted. Parents kept their children indoors after dark. For a town unaccustomed to fear, the Wrights' disappearance was a wound that would not heal. At the library, Sarah's desk sat empty, flowers and cards piling on top of it. At school, Emily's locker was plastered with notes from friends, drawings, and a photo of her smiling with her soccer team. It was grief without closure, and for years the forest kept its secret. Until that fateful morning, nearly 6 years later, when a hunter's dog unearthed what lay buried beneath the moss. The disappearance of the Wright family became the single greatest mystery Maple Hollow had ever faced. And in a town where little more than the occasional burglary made headlines, the case quickly consumed every conversation, every whisper, and every sleepless night. In the days after the Wrights vanished, the search effort swelled to extraordinary levels. Deputies, rangers, and volunteers formed long lines through the forest, shoulder to shoulder, combing every ravine, creek bed, and thicket. Helicopters circled overhead, their spotlights sweeping across the endless canopy. Dogs were brought in from across the state, trained to detect even the faintest scent trail. But the forest was unyielding. Every trail led nowhere. One searcher later recalled, "It was like the woods swallowed them whole. You could walk 20 feet, turn around, and already feel lost. That's how easy it is to disappear in there." News trucks descended on Maple Hollow. Satellite vans lined Main Street. Reporters shoved microphones at neighbors, asking for theories, digging for scandals. National networks framed it as a modern-day mystery in America's wilderness. The narrative was irresistible. A wholesome family, a quiet town, a vanishing act with no explanation. Sarah's sister gave tearful interviews, pleading for information. Emily's soccer coach broke down on camera, holding up her school photo and begging anyone who knew anything to come forward. But the spotlight was a double-edged sword. For every sympathetic viewer, There were also conspiracy theorists. Some claimed the family staged their disappearance. Others accused Mark of orchestrating it. Wild online forums speculated about cults, secret bunkers, even paranormal explanations. The Wrights became less like people and more like a story, fodder for theories, guesses, and late-night debates. Despite the lack of evidence, several main theories emerged. 1. The survivalist theory. Some believed Mark, an outdoorsman, had deliberately taken his family off the grid. Perhaps financial troubles or hidden debts pushed him to vanish. But investigators found no evidence of money problems, and Sarah's devotion to her sister and students made this theory hard to accept. 2. The accident theory. Others suggested they wandered off trail, fell victim to a tragic accident, perhaps a fall into a ravine or drowning in a hidden creek. But weeks of searching produced nothing. Not a shoe, not a torn scrap of fabric. 3. The predator theory. This was the theory that chilled residents most. The idea that someone was out there, waiting, stalking. Campers in nearby areas reported unsettling encounters. A man in camouflage watching from the tree line. An abandoned tent with a hunting knife still inside. Footsteps that followed hikers at night. Nothing ever confirmed. Nothing ever caught. Theories never became answers. They simply deepened the sense of unease. By the time the second anniversary came around, Maple Hollow had grown quieter, but not calmer. The search was over officially, but the absence hung over everything. At the library, Sarah's desk was left untouched, as if she might walk back in one day, apologize for being late, and pick up where she left off. At the high school, Emily's locker remained preserved. A shrine of photos, letters, and her last art project taped to the door. Mark's workshop sat frozen, tools on the bench gathering dust, a half-finished wooden chair standing like a ghost of routine. The Wrights were gone, but their presence was everywhere. Years passed. New families moved to town, unaware of the story at first, until locals warned them, "Don't go near Black Hollow at night." Parents told children not to play too close to the tree line. Hikers gave the forest a wider berth. The Wrights had become a ghost story, the kind told in hushed voices over campfires. But beneath the folklore was real grief, real fear. And for 6 years, the forest kept its secret. Until one ordinary morning, when a hunter's dog broke the silence and unearthed the truth Maple Hollow had been dreading. When Daniel Myers called 911 that autumn morning, dispatchers at first assumed it was another false alarm, maybe a hiker finding animal bones. But the tone in his voice, trembling and strained, told them this was different. Within an hour, deputies were on site. Yellow tape wound its way between the trees, fluttering in the breeze. The dog, Scout, sat restlessly nearby, still fixated on the patch of disturbed earth. What investigators unearthed that day changed everything. The soil gave way to more than just bones. As crime scene technicians carefully dug, they uncovered fragments of clothing, recognizable even after years underground. A torn piece of denim, later matched to a pair of jeans Sarah Wright had last been seen wearing. Nearby, small bones were found, heartbreakingly consistent with a child. The medical examiner would later confirm what the town already feared. The Wrights hadn't disappeared. They had been buried here, deliberately, in shallow graves that time and weather had nearly consumed. But the placement told its own story. The bodies had not been scattered by animals or nature. They were organized, hidden together. This wasn't an accident in the woods. It was a cover-up. News spread fast. Within hours, Maple Hollow was buzzing. Reporters once again filling Main Street, satellite dishes angled skyward. The headlines screamed, "Missing Wright family found in shallow graves." Mystery of Maple Hollow returns after 6 years. For investigators who had worked the case years earlier, the discovery felt like reopening an old wound. Retired detectives were called back for consultation. Evidence boxes, long stored away, were reopened and re-examined. The question was no longer what happened. It was who did this and why. The soil revealed more than bones. Near the burial site, search teams found two disturbing details: a length of rope, frayed but intact, with fibers suggesting it had once bound someone, and a rusted hunting knife, partially buried in leaves just yards from the graves. Both were sent for forensic testing, though years of exposure had degraded them. Still, the fact that they were left behind suggested haste or arrogance. One investigator remarked, "It felt like the killer never thought these graves would be found, almost as if the forest itself was supposed to keep the secret." With the graves uncovered, old theories resurfaced. The accident explanation was discarded immediately. This was homicide. But who? Suspicion once again circled back to those closest to the family. Some wondered, had Mark Wright snapped? Killed his wife and daughter before taking his own life? But that theory didn't hold. The remains showed Sarah and Emily had injuries consistent with restraint. Mark's remains showed blunt force trauma to the skull. Someone else had been there. Attention then turned outward. Hunters in the area? A drifter? A stranger? Or someone local? Maple Hollow found itself divided. Neighbors looked at one another with narrowed eyes. Old grudges and rumors resurfaced. In a town so small, the killer could very well be someone waving hello at the grocery store. The Vermont State Police announced a full reopening of the Wright case. New technology, unavailable 6 years earlier, was brought in: ground-penetrating radar, advanced DNA testing, soil analysis. Every item found at the burial site was cataloged again. Every interview from the original investigation was revisited. Every alibi checked and rechecked. And soon a startling detail emerged. When the knife was analyzed under advanced scanning, faint traces of DNA were recovered. Too degraded for full identification, but enough to suggest the presence of someone outside the Wright family. It was the first real lead in years. For Maple Hollow, the discovery reopened scars that had never healed. Candlelight vigils were held again. The church filled with mourners who wept for a family already long gone, but now confirmed to be victims of violence. But the grief was joined by something sharper: fear. If the killer had been out there all this time, blending into the quiet rhythm of town life, what else were they capable of? The forest had given up its secret, but the truth was only beginning to surface. The discovery of the Wright family's remains should have brought closure. Instead, it ignited a storm. Detectives faced a grim puzzle. Who had buried them in the forest, and why? The town wanted answers, but the case seemed to splinter into more questions with every step. Daniel Myers, the hunter who stumbled across the graves, was immediately questioned. After all, he had been in the exact spot where the remains lay hidden. Detectives asked, why had he chosen that trail? Why now, after 6 years? Daniel explained he'd hunted those woods his entire life. His dog scout had led him off trail that day, nothing more. Still, suspicion lingered. His name was run through every database, his property searched, his rifles examined. Nothing tied him to the Wrights. The theory collapsed, but not before whispers swept through Maple Hollow. What if the man who found them had put them there? Attention turned next to the Wrights' closest neighbor, Harold Benson. He had lived less than half a mile from the family and had been one of the first to report them missing. Old interviews resurfaced, showing Harold had given inconsistent statements back then. At first, he claimed he'd last seen the family on Saturday night. Later, he said Sunday morning. Which was it? Detectives wondered if Harold had harbored a grudge, perhaps over land disputes. Locals whispered that he had once accused Mark Wright of cutting down trees on his property line. Could a feud have escalated to murder? But Harold was elderly, frail, and forensic teams found no trace of evidence on his land. When his DNA was compared to what was found on the rusted knife, it didn't match. Another dead end. It was the frayed rope, not the bones, that finally gave investigators something tangible. Under microscopic analysis, the rope was revealed to be a specific kind of marine-grade nylon. It wasn't sold in local hardware stores. It was primarily used by dock workers and boaters. But Maple Hollow was a landlocked town. Who here would need rope meant for ships? Detectives expanded their net beyond the immediate community, checking supply orders, shipping companies, and marinas in the nearest cities. That was when they came across an unusual connection. A man named Earl Donovan. Earl was no stranger to law enforcement. A drifter with a history of theft and bar fights, he had once lived in Maple Hollow briefly, working construction before disappearing. Detectives learned Earl had been questioned briefly during the original investigation. Back then, he had a rock-solid alibi. His cousin, a long-haul trucker, had sworn under oath that Earl was with him in Pennsylvania that weekend. It was enough for overworked detectives to move on. But now, upon re-interviewing the cousin, his story changed. He admitted they'd had a falling out and he'd provided the false alibi out of fear of Earl, and later, guilt. "I didn't know it was for that," he told police, his voice shaking. "I thought it was for some petty theft, not a family." Earl's employment records placed him at a lumberyard just 20 miles from Maple Hollow. His time there was marked by suspensions for violent outbursts. A former co-worker, now coming forward, recalled Earl's fixation on the Wrights. He'd done some work for Mark Wright, came back fuming. Said the guy was a stuck-up cheapskate who'd refused to pay him extra for what Earl called unexpected complications with the job. Earl kept saying, "He'll see. Everybody pays." This detail wasn't in the original files. Investigators realized Earl's connection to the Wrights was not just passing. It was volatile. The rusted hunting knife was sent for further analysis. The blade itself was too corroded for prints, but under ultraviolet light, a faint inscription was revealed on the handle, ED. It was subtle, barely legible, but to investigators it was a bombshell. ED Earl Donovan. When questioned again, Earl denied everything. He said he never carved his initials into a knife, that investigators were twisting evidence. Yet his denials only made detectives push harder. As word spread that Earl was under investigation, Maple Hollow divided once more. Some locals remembered him as hot-tempered, unpredictable. Others insisted he was a scapegoat, someone easy to blame. One witness came forward, a woman named Linda Carver, who worked at the gas station on the edge of town. She swore she'd seen Earl at the station on the very night the Wrights vanished. Mud on his boots, smelling of alcohol, pacing nervously. It wasn't proof, but it was another crack in his story. The real turning point came when forensic scientists, using advanced new techniques, re-examined the degraded DNA on the knife. Technology that hadn't existed 6 years earlier now allowed them to isolate partial profiles with higher accuracy. The results came back. The DNA belonged to Earl Donovan. It wasn't a full profile, time and exposure had eroded too much. But it was enough to confirm his presence at the burial site. On a cold November morning, police moved in. Earl was arrested outside a rundown trailer where he had been living. The town watched as he was led away in handcuffs, reporters shouting questions, cameras flashing. Was this truly the man who had killed the Wright family? Detectives believed so, but what no one yet understood was why. The Wright family had no known enemies, no ties to crime, no debts, and yet, their remains had been hidden in the forest for years, left to rot in silence. Earl Donovan was in custody. The DNA pointed to him. The knife bore his initials. The rope linked to his past work. But motive was the missing piece. Without it, the case was strong but not airtight. Prosecutors feared a jury might see only circumstantial connections. And as Earl sat in an interrogation room, arms crossed, eyes cold, he said just 5 words that sent a chill through investigators. "You don't know the half." The arrest of Earl Donovan shook Maple Hollow to its core. For 6 years, the Wright family's disappearance had been a wound the town couldn't heal. Now, with the suspect finally in custody, everyone hoped for closure. But in the courtroom, things would prove far more complicated. Long before jury selection began, the case exploded in the media. Headlines screamed, "Drifter charged in Wright family murders. Small-town nightmare nears end." True crime programs descended on Maple Hollow. News vans lined the courthouse steps. Reporters interviewed locals who swore they had always known Earl was trouble. But defense attorneys painted a different picture. Earl was being railroaded. The evidence was old, degraded. The DNA, partial at best. The knife, rusted beyond certainty. And the initials, ED, could have meant anything. By the time trial began, the town was split in two. Those convinced Earl was guilty, and those terrified that investigators had once again latched onto the wrong man. The prosecution opened with a chilling statement. For 6 years, the Wright family lay buried in shallow graves, silenced by a man who thought he could erase them. But the earth remembers. The forest remembers. And today we will prove that man was Earl Donovan. The defense countered immediately. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is a witch hunt. The state has no eyewitnesses, no clear motive, and evidence so decayed it could point to anyone. They want a villain, and they've chosen Earl Donovan because he's an easy target." The stage was set for a battle that would test the very limits of truth and justice. First on the stand were the forensic experts. They explained the rope fibers, the DNA trace, and the knife inscription. Under direct examination, their words were damning. The jury leaned in as scientists described how modern techniques isolated Earl's DNA from the knife's handle, despite years of erosion. But under cross-examination, the defense poked holes. The DNA sample was small. The rope could have been bought by anyone. The initials could have been carved by another ED somewhere in the world. The jury shifted uneasily. Next came Linda Carver, the gas station attendant. She recalled Earl pacing the night the Wrights disappeared. Muddy boots, nervous hands, the smell of alcohol. The prosecution painted her testimony as critical. Proof Earl was near Maple Hollow that night. The defense, however, cast doubt. Linda hadn't come forward for 6 years. Could she truly remember a single night with certainty after so long? Or was her memory shaped by news reports, suggestions, and small-town gossip? The jury's faces betrayed confusion. Prosecutors built their story piece by piece. Earl had worked odd jobs for the Wrights. He had opportunity knowing the family's routines. He had access to the woods, strong enough to dig graves. He had left behind the knife that bore his initials. They argued Earl, likely drunk and enraged after a dispute with Mark Wright, had killed the entire family in a fit of rage before burying them in the forest. But as compelling as the narrative was, the question still lingered. Why? Why would Earl annihilate an entire family? Earl's attorneys countered with ferocity. They reminded the jury there were no eyewitnesses to the crime. No blood evidence tying Earl to the Wrights' home. No fingerprints. They painted Earl as a scapegoat. A rough man, yes, but not a killer. And then, in a bold move, they hinted at an alternate suspect. Someone investigators had overlooked. The neighbor, Harold Benson. They replayed Harold's conflicting statements from years ago, raising the possibility that maybe he had killed the Wrights over a land feud. Suddenly, doubt spread like wildfire. Just when the trial seemed to blur into uncertainty, the prosecution called a witness they had fought to include: Emily Wright's best friend, Sarah Keller. Now in her 20s, Sarah took the stand, clutching tissues. She explained to the jury that in the chaotic days after Emily vanished, she had told a uniformed officer about a phone call. "I was 14. I was crying. I said Emily told me a man at her house gave her a bad feeling. I didn't even remember his name. The officer wrote it down, but I guess it got lost." It was only years later, when Earl's name was in the news, that the memory crystallized with terrifying clarity. She'd been in therapy, working through the trauma, and the name had surfaced. Through tears, she described the last phone call she ever had with Emily. She said her dad had hired this man to fix their fence. She said he'd been staring at her while she played in the yard. She said it made her skin crawl. She said his name was Earl. The defense's cross-examination was brutal, attacking the reliability of a memory recalled after 6 years. But the seed was planted. Sarah's testimony gave the jury a motive beyond a simple dispute: a deep, unsettling resentment from a violent man, possibly triggered by a perceived slight from Mark and a fixation on his family. In a risky move, Earl himself took the stand. He was surly and combative, showing the jury not humanity, but contempt. He denied knowing anything about the knife or the rope. When the prosecutor pressed him on the co-worker's testimony about the payment dispute, Earl's composure cracked. "He owed me," Earl snarled. "Thought he could look down on me? I went out there to get what was mine. But I didn't kill them." The courtroom erupted. The prosecutor pounced. "You went out to the campsite? You confronted them? What happened then, Mr. Donovan?" Realizing his mistake, Earl clammed up, muttering, "I'm saying nothing else." But the jury had heard it. He had placed himself at the scene of the crime on the night they disappeared. The prosecution hammered home Earl's slip. He admitted it. He admitted being there. You cannot bury a family without being guilty. The defense, desperate, pleaded. You heard him, he said he didn't kill them. Reasonable doubt lives in that sentence. The jury now carried the weight of Maple Hollow's grief, fear, and rage on their shoulders. Days later, the jury returned. The foreman's voice was steady. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree." Cries broke out in the courtroom. The Wright family's relatives wept openly. Earl showed no reaction. He simply stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, eyes cold. The judge sentenced him to life without parole. The town exhaled, but uneasily, because something about Earl's last words still lingered. "You don't know the half." When the gavel came down and Earl Donovan was sentenced to life without parole, Maple Hollow erupted with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. For 6 years, the Wright family's disappearance had been a festering wound. Now, at last, the community felt justice had been served. But justice in Maple Hollow was never that simple. In the days after the verdict, locals gathered in the diner, the church, and on quiet porches to talk. Some swore Earl's conviction was the only thing that made sense. Others weren't so sure. They remembered Earl's final outburst on the stand. "I was there, but I didn't kill them." Was it just the desperate denial of a guilty man? Or was there truth in those words? Truth the court had never uncovered? Reporters left, but the question stayed. If Earl didn't kill the Wrights, why was his DNA on the knife? Why did he admit to being there? And what about Harold Benson, the neighbor with the land feud? Though acquitted in the court of public opinion after Earl's conviction, Harold quietly sold his property and left Maple Hollow within a year. He told friends he couldn't stand the whispers anymore. A background check he'd never undergone revealed a past conviction for assault. From a fight he'd gotten into defending Earl Donovan, his childhood friend, 2 decades prior. Their friendship was a well-buried secret from a time before Harold had tried to become a respectable member of the community. No one saw him again. At the edge of town, a memorial now stands where the Wrights' home once stood. School children leave flowers there each year. Teachers remind them of the tragedy, and parents tell their kids never to wander too far into the woods. The Wrights became more than just a family. They became a symbol of innocence lost, of a small town's darkest chapter, and of the way secrets can hide in plain sight. Even behind bars, Earl's words gnawed at a few investigators. The official report closed the case. But in a private memo, the lead detective wrote, "The forensic evidence points to Donovan. His presence is confirmed. But the logistics don't add up. Subduing 3 people, digging 2 graves deep enough to conceal them, all in one night, in the dark, by one man. It's possible, but it's not probable." Without evidence, the case was closed. Officially, unofficially, files stayed open on desks, marked in red, Wright family, possible second perpetrator. Years passed, but every so often, hikers in Maple Hollow still reported strange things. A shoe buried under leaves, a rusted shovel, faint carvings in tree trunks. Whether these were remnants of the Wrights' tragedy or simply echoes of imagination, no one knew. But one thing was certain. The forest that had hidden the Wrights' graves for 6 years still held secrets. The memorial at the edge of town is a quiet place. The flowers are changed, the plaques are polished, and the children are warned. The official story is written in court transcripts and news archives. Justice was served. But in the woods, the silence feels different now. It doesn't feel empty. It feels watchful. Because the truth the forest finally gave up was only a piece of a larger, darker whole. Earl Donovan is in prison, but his last words echo through Maple Hollow, a ghost in the machine of justice. You don't know the half, and so the mystery endures, not as a question of who, but of who else. The case is closed. The truth is still out there, buried deep in those woods.